evening in 1844, a conversation took place between two young men that heralded a new era for the human race. A Persian merchant announced to a traveller in the city of Shiraz that he was the bearer of a divine revelation destined to transform the spiritual life of humanity. The merchant's name was Sayyid Ali Muhammad, and he is known to history as the Bab or the Gate. Born in Iran in October 1819, the Bab was the symbolic gate between past ages of prophecy and a new age of fulfillment for humanity. His main objective was to awaken people to the fact that a new period in human history had begun, one which would witness the unification of humanity and the emergence of a world civilization of spiritual and material prosperity. He explained to his followers that this great day would be established through the influence of a divinely inspired educator, whom he called He Whom God Shall Make Manifest, and that he himself was the herald of this divine educator. The movement founded by the Bab in 1844 was the precursor of the Bahá'í faith and marked a new age in the history of humanity. To mark the bicentenary of his birth and to celebrate the life, mission and heroism of the Bab and his followers, the Irish Bahá'í community has produced 19 short videos. We hope you enjoy them.
Suppose anyone could tell us more about the childhood and early life and appearance of Christ. How glad we should be to know it. Now it is impossible to find out much. But in the case of the Bab, it is possible. And I feel that now that it is possible, it may be neglected. And someday, when many men long to know more, it will be impossible. So let us earn the thanks of posterity and provide against that day now.
"2019 marks the 200th anniversary of the birth of the Bab.
The founder of a new religious movement in his native Persia, his dramatic life, ministry and death captured the imaginations not only of his countrymen, but of many European observers and admirers, who sought to capture the spirit of his movement in prose, poetry and drama. Though the fame of his movement reached Europe, and though many Europeans and other Westerners would eventually embrace his cause,
In his own lifetime, only one Westerner is known to have met him, preserving for posterity an unbiased
first-hand account of the young man who claimed to be the gate unto the knowledge of God. Dr. William Cormac was born in 1819, the same year as the Bab. The son of Dr. John Cormac of County Kilkenny, Ireland, William spent most of his youth in Persia, his father having served as a physician to the royal family. William himself, after completing his medical training in London, came into the service of the future king, whom he accompanied in 1857 to the city of Tabriz, where William would become a direct witness to the tumult of those days, and would come face to face with the one who stood as the focal point of these momentous events. By the summer of 1848, the Babi movement had spread all across Persia, provoking the violent retribution of the government and ecclesiastical authorities, as thousands and thousands declared their belief in the new revelation. The Bab was imprisoned and repeatedly exiled in increasingly remote and harsh conditions, before finally being brought to trial in Tabriz. In that meeting, in the presence of the future king, the Bab emphatically announced his claim and mission, leaving those gathered there in a state of bewilderment. It was in the course of these proceedings that Dr. Cormac was called on to interview the prisoner, in Dr. Cormac's words, to see whether he was of sane mind or merely a madman, to decide the question whether to put him to death or not. Dr. Cormac's report recommended that the Bab's life be spared. The Bab was taken back into captivity, where he was beaten and struck on the face, a blow which produced a great wound and swelling. On being asked whether he wished a doctor to attend his wound, the Bab specifically asked for Dr. Cormac, who accordingly treated him for a few days. He described the Bab as a very mild and delicate-looking man, with a melodious, soft voice which struck me much. In fact, his whole look and deportment went far to dispose one in his favour. He goes on to write that the characteristic fanaticism of Persia in those days does not exist in his religion, nor is there that restraint of females that now exists.
The story of the Bab has captured the imagination of millions of people around the globe. Dr. Cormac's reflections on meeting him provide a unique window into his life and forge an immortal link between Ireland and the earliest history of the Baha'i faith.
On a hot afternoon in May 1844, a young man called Mullah Hussein arrived in Shiraz with his two friends. They had no idea what was about to happen. Later, Mullah Hussein described how he had felt drawn towards Shiraz, as though by a magnet, he said, but at the time he hadn't thought anything of it. The three young scholars who arrived together in the city were on a sacred quest. They had dedicated their lives to the search for the one promised in all the Holy Scriptures, who they believed was soon to appear. Mullah Hussein left his friends that afternoon, promising to meet them later for evening prayers. And he was walking towards the city when a young man in a green turban approached him. As he later recounted, the youth who met me outside the gate of Shiraz overwhelmed me with expressions of affection and loving kindness. He extended to me a warm invitation to visit his home. As I entered the house, a feeling of unutterable joy invaded my being. Later that evening, when the young man, whose name was Saeed Ali Muhammad, announced that he was the fulfillment of all the signs of the Promised One, Mullah Hussein didn't know what to think. And then, suddenly, and without being asked, Sayyid Ali Muhammad began to reveal a commentary on the Surah of Joseph, which is a chapter from the Quran. Mullah Hussein was astounded. This was the very chapter his teacher had once told him the Promised One would address. From that point on, he knew his search was over. He had finally found the Promised One. Before they parted, the young man swore Mullah Hussein to secrecy. He said, "I am the Bab, the gate of God. 18 souls must in the beginning spontaneously and of their own accord accept me and recognize the truth of my revelation." Mullah Hussein agreed to keep the secret, but his heart was on fire with his wondrous discovery. In his own words, excitement, joy, awe and wonder stirred the depths of my soul. I seemed to be the voice of Gabriel personified, calling unto all mankind, "Awake, for lo, the morning light is broken, for he who is your Promised One is come." On May the 22nd, 1844, Mullah Hussein attained his heart's desire, and the mission of the Bab began.
When the Bab announced his mission in May of 1844, he was only 25 years old. But the truth was, he had always shown signs of being a very extraordinary person. He was born Sayyid Ali Muhammad in Shiraz on October 20th, 1819. His father died when he was a child, and his uncle became his guardian. Soon after he started school, his teacher sent him home, saying that there was nothing he could teach such a gifted child. His uncle wasn't happy to hear this and told him to just try and act like the other children. He did his best, but it was clear that he wasn't like his fellow pupils. And it wasn't just his intelligence. Even as a child, his character and gentleness were equally impressive to everyone who knew him. When the Bab was only 16, he was already managing his uncle's business in Bushire, and there his reputation for fairness and being just grew. One story goes that a man who gave him goods to sell received more in payment than he expected, because the Bab explained if the market was at its best, the goods would have fetched that amount. And it wasn't only his friends and acquaintances who recognized his greatness. At this time there lived an important Islamic scholar named Sayyid Kazem. People flocked from all over to hear him speak about the coming of the Promised One. One day Sayyid Kazem summoned his pupil Hassan to come to his house before dawn. When he arrived, Sayyid Kazem announced that a highly distinguished person had arrived in the city and that they had to visit him. They set off and soon came to a house where a youth in a green turban was waiting at the door. He greeted them lovingly, and Hassan was amazed by the reverence his renowned teacher showed to this young man. 3 days later, the youth arrived at one of Sayyid Kazem's lectures. When the Sayyid saw him, he said, "Lo, the truth is more manifest than the ray of light that has fallen upon that lap." Hassan could then see a ray of light had fallen upon the lap of the youth. One of the Sayyid's disciples spoke up then, asking why he didn't just reveal the name of the Promised One if he knew it. Sayyid Kazem shook his head and pointed with his finger to his own throat, implying that if he spoke, they would both be in mortal danger. 3 years later, the Bab did, of course, announce his mission, and just as Sayyid Kazem had predicted, he ended up giving his life for that announcement.
The very first people to recognize and follow the Bab were known as the Letters of the Living. There were 19 letters in total, 18 plus the Bab. Mullah Hussein was the first letter of the living. He was sworn to secrecy by the Bab, who said that all of the letters of the living had to find him and recognize his station spontaneously and by their own actions. Sure enough, within a short time, without anyone divulging the secret, 17 more people found the Bab through their own efforts. All but one of the letters of the living met the Bab face to face. The exception was a young woman, a poetess named Tahira. She saw his face in a dream and sent a letter to him to acknowledge that she recognized his station. The Bab sent the letters of the living all across the land to spread his teachings and to prepare the way for him whom God shall make manifest. At the start he warned them that the time was not yet ready for them to tell anyone his identity, but instead they were to say that the gate to the Promised One had been opened. As the letters of the living undertook the tasks given to them by the Bab, they could hear his words echoing in their hearts. You are the first letters that have been generated from the primal point, the first springs that have welled out from the source of this revelation. I am preparing you for the advent of a mighty day. The secret of the day that is to come is now concealed. It can neither be divulged nor estimated. Scatter throughout the length and breadth of this land, and with steadfast feet and sanctified hearts prepare the way for his coming. They did as the Bab asked. The letters of the living didn't have any worldly power or any special station. Many of them gave up their jobs and homes to spread the teachings of the Bab, and some of them even gave up their lives. However, their place in history is guaranteed. These letters of the living were heroic souls who dedicated themselves to seeking the truth and sacrificed everything for the well-being of humanity.
By autumn 1844, only 2 of the letters of the living remained in Shiraz with the Bab, Mullah Hussein and Qudus. The Bab announced that he planned to go on pilgrimage and that Qudus would accompany him. Mullah Hussein was disappointed as he'd hoped to go, but the Bab told him that he needed him to travel to Tehran instead. As he said, "A secret lies hidden in that city. When made manifest, it shall turn the earth into paradise." the Bab said that he would not begin his pilgrimage until he heard what happened in Tehran. So Mullah Hussein set out as instructed. Eventually he arrived in Tehran. There a man named Mullah Muhammad sought him out, and in conversation told him of a young man living in the city who had distinguished himself by his virtuous life, his high attainments, his loving kindness and liberality. This is how Mullah Muhammad described what happened. The eagerness with which Mullah Hussein questioned me, and the sense of delight with which he welcomed every particular I gave him, greatly surprised me. With his face beaming with satisfaction and joy, he inquired, "Will you deliver into his hands a trust from me?" "Most assuredly," was my reply. He then gave me a scroll wrapped in a piece of cloth and requested me to hand it to him the next day at the hour of dawn. Next morning, Mullah Muhammad went to the home of Mirza Hussein Ali, or Baha'u'llah, as he would become known. Baha'u'llah read the scroll and declared that the mission of the Bab was clearly from God. Later, Mullah Muhammad described what happened when he returned. I was amazed at the behavior of Mullah Hussein. What could be, I thought to myself, the nature of the bond that unites these two souls? What could have kindled so fervid a fellowship in their hearts? I was puzzled by this thought and could not unravel its mystery. As soon as he could, Mullah Hussein wrote to the Bab to tell him what had happened, and the Bab and Qudus prepared for pilgrimage.
Having received a letter from Mullah Hussein about his meeting with Baha'u'llah in Tehran, the Bab and Qudus left for pilgrimage.
The first part of their journey was by boat and it took 2 months.
During this time, many of their fellow travelers came to admire the Bab. There was one traveler, though, who was jealous of the respect shown to the Bab. He was an arrogant man who was constantly picking fights with other passengers, and he made the Bab a particular target.
Everybody was unhappy about this behavior, especially the captain of the ship, who ordered the man to be thrown overboard.
The sailors grabbed the man, preparing to throw him into the sea. The Bab intervened and asked the captain to free the troublemaker.
The captain refused. The sailors moved then to toss the man overboard, and the Bab threw himself at the prisoner and held on to him, all the while asking the captain to reconsider.
The captain couldn't believe it. After all, this young man was the one who had suffered the most.
The Bab pleaded for the man because, as he explained, people who behaved badly only harmed themselves, so one should be tolerant and forgiving.
This time the captain agreed and freed the man. When they finished their voyage, the Bab and his friends traveled by land to Mecca.
There, as they walked with thousands of other pilgrims around the shrine known as the Kaaba, the Bab took hold of the ring on the door of this famous shrine and announced 3 times in a clear voice,
"I am that Qa'im whose advent you have been awaiting." The pilgrims near him fell silent for a few seconds and then recommenced praying.
Though nothing else happened at that point, the news of his claim soon spread. The Bab also wrote a letter to the sheriff of Mecca declaring his mission. Impressed as the sheriff was by the letter, he wasn't sure who had written it.
After the Bab's death, the sheriff discovered the identity of the author and was very upset to learn of his ill treatment.
The Bab arrived back from pilgrimage in the spring of 1845.
He parted from Rodus with the words that foreshadowed the future for both of them.
The days of your companionship with me are drawn to a close. The hour of separation has struck, a separation which no reunion
will follow except in the kingdom of God,
in the presence of the King of Glory.
In the months that followed his pilgrimage, the Bab lived under surveillance in Shiraz. His influence grew stronger, and the authorities made every effort to discredit him. But this didn't always work out as they'd planned. For example, the time the renowned scholar Sayyid Yahya was sent by the Shah to investigate the claims of the Bab. When he arrived in Shiraz, Sayyid Yahya was looking forward to meeting the Bab and disproving his claims. In the first meeting, Sayyid Yahya asked several difficult metaphysical questions about Islam. The Bab answered convincingly. Sayyid Yahya was a little shaken, but concealed it and arranged to meet the Bab a second time. The result was the same. Now Sayyid Yahya had to do something more radical to disprove and discredit the claims of the Bab, as he later described it himself. I resolved that in my third interview with the Bab, I would, in my inmost heart, request him to reveal for me a commentary on the Surah Qatar. Should he, unasked by me, reveal this commentary, I then would be convinced of the divine character of his mission and would readily embrace his cause. If not, I would refuse to acknowledge him. As soon as I was ushered into his presence, a sense of fear suddenly seized me. My limbs quivered. I, who had never discovered the slightest trace of timidity in myself, was now so awed and shaken that I could not remain standing on my feet. The Bab, beholding my plight, taking hold of my hand, seated me beside him. "Seek for me," he said, "whatever is in your heart's desire. I will readily reveal it to you." I was speechless. He smiled as he gazed at me and said, "Were I to reveal for you the commentary on the Surah Qatar, would you acknowledge that my words are born of the Spirit of God? Would you recognize that my utterance can in no wise be associated with sorcery or magic?" The Bab called for paper and pen and began to reveal the commentary. When he finished, he read it out loud. My heart leaped madly as I heard him pour out, in accents of unutterable sweetness, those treasures enshrined in that sublime commentary. Such was the state of certitude to which I had attained, that if all the powers of the earth were to be leagued against me, they would be powerless to shake my confidence in the greatness of his cause. The governor was very unhappy with the outcome of Sayyid Yahya's visit, especially when he heard that the Shah was reported to have said, "We have been lately informed that Sayyid Yahya Arabi has become a Babi. If this is true, it behoves us to cease belittling the cause of that Sayyid." Sayyid Yahya is known as Wahid, the unique one, a designation given by the Bab himself.
Manichair Khan was a tyrant whose reputation for cruelty was well known. To make matters worse, he also had a lot of power because he was the governor of Isfahan and a great friend of the Shah. This man was the last person you'd think the Bab would turn to when the authorities in Shiraz began to persecute him and his followers. By the summer of 1846, so many people had begun to follow the Bab that the Shirazi authorities wanted him executed. The Shah didn't agree, so they decided to secretly kill the Bab instead. However, the very night they were to kill him, a severe cholera epidemic swept the city. The governor fled, sending his chief constable to arrest the Bab. The constable then discovered that his own sons were ill with cholera. He begged the Bab to help. The Bab gave him some water that he'd used for his ablutions and told him to give it to his sons. The constable did as instructed and the boys recovered. When the governor returned, the constable begged him to spare the life of the Bab. He agreed on condition that the Bab left the city immediately. And so, the Bab left Shiraz. Shortly after he left, the Bab wrote to Manashir Khan, the governor of Isfahan, requesting shelter. The governor was so impressed with the letter that he granted the request. The Bab lived in Isfahan for 18 months. During that time, hundreds of people from every rank began to follow the Bab. Some would even try to take the water he'd used to bathe, as they believed it had healing powers. Manashir Khan himself also became a follower of the Bab, stating, "I solemnly testify to my belief in the reality of the superhuman power with which this youth is endowed, a power which no amount of learning can ever impart." The clergy in Isfahan feared the Bab's influence and passed a verdict of death on him, but he had the protection of the governor, so he was safe. Manashir Khan was so transformed that he realized his wealth was as a result of oppression, and he offered to give it all to the Bab. The Bab accepted, but then immediately returned it. Then Manashir Khan offered the Bab his army so that he could march to Tehran to tell the Shah of his message. The Bab said he didn't need any army, as his cause wouldn't triumph by use of force, but rather by the efforts and sacrifice of the poor and lowly. However, the Bab saw that the governor was trying to atone for past evils and thanked him, saying, "So lofty a purpose is to me even more precious than the act itself." Manashir Khan died shortly after this offer. With his protector dead, the enemies of the Bab could now freely pursue their campaign to destroy him.
By 1848, the influence of the Bab was so widespread that the authorities were very worried, and they imprisoned him first in Maku and then in Chehrik, both remote towns in Azerbaijan. This didn't work. His influence grew, his followers continued to multiply. Even the prison wardens and guards became friendly towards him. In July of 1848, the Bab was brought from his prison in Chehrik to the city of Tabriz for public examination. When the people of Tabriz heard that the Bab was coming to their city, there was great excitement. In order to try to prevent people from seeing him, the authorities housed the Bab in a place outside the gates of the city, and the Prime Minister ordered an immediate public hearing to be held in the official residence of the governor of Azerbaijan. The purpose of the hearing was to discredit the Bab and to look for the most effective way to stop his influence. Though the public hearing was outside the city itself, once word got out, throngs of people went to the governor's residence to try to catch a glimpse of the Bab's face. When he arrived, the Bab observed that every seat in that hall was occupied, except one reserved for the Crown Prince. He greeted the assembly and without the slightest hesitation proceeded to occupy that vacant seat. The spirit of power which shone from his whole being appeared to overawe the assembled clergy and officials. Not one soul in that distinguished assembly dared breathe a single word for several minutes. Finally, one of the officials found his voice and asked, "Whom do you claim to be, and what is the message which you have brought?" The Bab answered, without hesitation, I am, the promised one." The room fell silent again, and many of the people dropped their heads in awe and confusion. Some more questions followed, trying to trick and discredit him. The Bab answered the questions and continued to say that he was the promised one. The outcome of the public hearing was not as the Prime Minister and clerics had hoped, so shortly afterwards it was decided by the authorities to inflict the torture of the bastinado on the Bab. But even this didn't go as they planned. The guards refused to carry out the sentence, and one of the senior clerics had to personally whip the soles of the Bab's feet. It was during this torture that the Bab was struck on the face and was later treated by Dr. William Cormac, the only Westerner ever to have met him. Having failed to intimidate the Bab or destroy his influence, the authorities sent him back to his remote prison in Chihrik.
Around the same time as the Bab faced a public tribunal in Tabriz, there was a gathering of Bahá'ís in a small hamlet called Badasht. The meeting was organized by Baha'u'llah to settle a vital issue. Was this new religion just an offshoot of Islam, or was it an independent faith? As a conclusion was being reached on this question, hundreds of miles away, the Bab was also announcing his station before the tribunal in Tabriz. The central character in this drama in Badasht was the only female letter of the living, and the only one not to meet the Bab face to face, Tahereh. Tahereh was born Fatima Baragani and was given the name Khuratul Ain, or Solace of the Eyes. This was the name she was known by in 1848 when she was a leading figure in the Babi community. For the gathering in Badasht, Baha'u'llah rented 3 gardens, one for Khudus, one for Khuratul Ain, and one for himself. One day Baha'u'llah said he was too ill to leave his tent, so Khudus and most of the others congregated in his tent. Khuratul Ain sent a messenger to ask Khudus to visit her. He refused. Her messenger left only to return and repeat the request. Khudus refused again. And then Khuratul Ain walked into the tent, her beautiful face completely unveiled. There was consternation. This woman, who was considered a pious and holy woman, was now unveiled in public. Many of them thought it completely immoral and couldn't believe their eyes. Some of them had never even looked at her shadow, and now. One man was so upset he cut his own throat and ran away screaming. A number of others also left. The beautiful poetess seated herself beside Khudus. Unperturbed, she waited for calm, and then she smiled and eloquently addressed those who remained. It's hard to imagine how much courage it took for any woman to appear unveiled in public in Persia in 1848. Tahereh's actions were so brave that they were famous and prompted British scholar Edward Granville Browne to say of her, "The appearance of such a woman as Khuratul Ain is in any country and any age a rare phenomenon. But in a country such as Persia, it is a prodigy, nay, almost a miracle." Had the Babi religion no other claim to greatness, this were sufficient, that it produced a heroine like Khuratul Ain. To demonstrate what he thought of her, that day Baha'u'llah gave her a new title, Tahereh, the Pure One. When Tahereh showed her unveiled face in public, the clarion call of the new order had been sounded. As obsolete conventions were fearlessly swept away by this brave woman, nobody doubted that this was indeed an independent new faith. The way was now clear for the proclamation of the new dispensation.
By the end of 1848, Persia had a new king. Muhammad Shah had died and his 17-year-old son, Nasruddin Shah took the throne. During the rule of Muhammad Shah, the Bab had been imprisoned in Azerbaijan. However, this was largely due to the interference of clerics and officials who wanted to ensure that the Shah and the Bab never met. They were terrified that the king would come under the influence of the Bab and that their stranglehold on power would end. When the new Shah came to the throne, things were different. He was young and easily convinced that this Babi movement should be destroyed. This change regime brought the first official state action against the Babis at the fort of the shrine of Sheikh Tabarsi. By September of 1848, when the old king died, Mullah Hussein had taken refuge with around 300 Babis in the shrine of Sheikh Tabarsi. Having some months earlier received the Bab's green turban and instructions from him to free the imprisoned Qudus, Mullah Hussein had set out with his band of companions. However, as they travelled, they were subject to constant attacks by mobs incited to hatred by local clerics. Galvanised by his dedication to the Bab and his desire to protect his fellow Babis, the once timid scholar Mullah Hussein developed a reputation as a force to be reckoned with as he valiantly fought off attack after attack. Arriving at the shrine of Sheikh Tabarsi, Mullah Hussein and his companions built rudimentary defences to protect themselves, and by the end of 1848, even more Babis had come to shelter from persecution in that fort. Soon after they arrived, Baha'u'llah visited and assured them that Qudus would be freed should they demand his release. They did as Baha'u'llah suggested, and Qudus was indeed released and came to join them at Sheikh Tabarsi. For several months, thousands of troops unsuccessfully attacked the untrained, unequipped, God-intoxicated people. In January of 1849, the governor of the province arrived with extra troops. By then, more than 6,000 troops surrounded the fort. Despite being outnumbered, with heroic courage, the Babis routed the governor and his troops. On hearing of this humiliation, the Prime Minister wrote to the governor, berating him of his failure to destroy the Babis. "I have charged you with the mission of subduing a handful of young and contemptible students. I have placed at your disposal the army of the Shah, and yet you have allowed it to suffer such a disgraceful defeat." The courage and resourcefulness of these 500 souls, under the leadership of Mullah Hussein and Qudus, continued for months to defy all government efforts. The siege of Sheikh Tabarsi was proving to be harder to end than government officials had ever imagined.
In late 1848, 500 Babis, under the leadership of Mullah Hussein and Qudus, took refuge at the shrine of Sheikh Tabarsi in the province of Mazindaran. The provincial and government authorities were confident that they would soon destroy this band of civilians and stem the growth of this new religion which was trying to bring change to Persian society. To defeat this group of civilians who had built rudimentary fortifications around the shrine, the government sent company after company of soldiers to wipe out the Babis, to no avail. By the spring of 1849, it was clear that something more was needed if the government wasn't to continue being humiliated by these few hundred Babis. Thousands of troops arrived to surround the fort. They cut off the water supply and sources of food, hoping to starve them into submission. As always, the Babis resisted and prevailed. During a defensive action taken in February 1849, Mullah Hussein was shot in the chest. This valiant protector of the Babis, and the very first person to recognize the station of the Bab, was carried, mortally injured, into the fort. Shortly afterwards, he died. Qudus tenderly wrapped Mullah Hussein in one of his own shirts and buried him within the confines of the fort. By March 1849, the Bahá'ís in the fort were surrounded by almost 12,000 troops and were being bombarded by up to 200 shells each day. By April, more than half of their number were dead, and the men, women and children who survived were severely weakened by starvation. But they still didn't surrender. Attacks, threats and punishments had failed to defeat them. So the governor, tired of being humiliated by this handful of civilians, resorted to treachery. He sent a message swearing a solemn oath on the Quran that if they now surrendered, they would be safe. So they finally agreed. As soon as the Bahá'ís began to emerge from the fortified shrine, they were attacked. Many were killed outright. Others were captured and tortured to death. The few who survived were sold into slavery. The governor took Qudus prisoner. In spite of himself though, the more the governor spent with Qudus, the less keen he was to harm him. He decided to send Qudus to the king and let him decide his fate. But the authorities in the region had sworn to destroy Qudus and demanded he be given to them. Fearing for his own life, the governor fled. With terrifying savagery, Qudus was tortured and murdered by a mob in a most cruel way. And thus ended the siege of the fort of the shrine of Sheikh Tabarsi. But it will forever be remembered as a period where a few hundred valiant, God-intoxicated souls managed to outwit, outfight and outlast the army of the Persian king.
In 1850, as the number of the followers of the Bab grew, so did the persecution. The authorities were now willing to take any and all measures to achieve the extermination of the Bahá'ís. In May of that year, the renowned scholar Vahid led 72 Bahá'ís to take refuge at a fort outside the town of Neris. Just a couple of years earlier, Vahid had himself become a follower of the Bab when he was sent by the Shah to investigate this new religion. Now he was trying to protect himself and his fellow believers from certain death. During a month-long siege, the governor sent thousands of troops to Neris, to no avail. As it became clear that the valiant handful of Bahá'ís couldn't be defeated, the government forces changed their tactics. The commanders outside the fort sent a conciliatory message to Vahid, pretending that there had been a misunderstanding. Hitherto, as we were ignorant of the true character of your fate, we have allowed the mischief makers to induce us to believe that every one of you have violated the sacred precepts of Islam. They then explained that they now understood that the Bahá'ís had no political motive or desire to attack the state, and that their teaching did not involve any great departure from the fundamental teachings of Islam. They asked that Bahá'í representatives come to speak with them and promised, if you prove yourselves able to demonstrate the true claims of your faith, we too will readily embrace it, for we are not the enemies of truth, and none of us wish to deny it. Your leader, Vahid, we have always recognized as one of the ablest champions of Islam. This letter was attached to a copy of the Quran with the promise, let that holy book decide whether the claim you advance is true or false. We entreat you to refuse to shed more blood before attempting to establish the truth of your cause. Vahid knew this offer was insincere, but as it had been sworn on the Quran, he wouldn't ignore it. So he and 5 attendees went to the enemy camp. After 3 days' discussion, Vahid was pressurized to write to his people, assuring them that they were safe to leave the fortress and return home. He complied, but also wrote a second letter warning his companions of the treachery. This second letter was never delivered. As soon as the Bahá'ís emerged from the fort, they were slaughtered or taken prisoner. And like Qaddus, Vahid himself was cruelly tortured and murdered. The victorious army marched back to Shiraz with women and children as prisoners, and the heads of the men raised aloft on lances. Now, all over the country, state-supported mobs gained strength, and Bahá'í men, women and children were tortured, dispossessed, enslaved and murdered in their thousands.
The siege of Zanjan, which began in May 1850, is known as the most devastating of all the Bahá'í upheavals. During this siege, which lasted 9 months, almost 3,000 Bahá'ís, under the leadership of the heroic Hujat, were besieged by the troops of the Prime Minister in a fort in the town of Zanjan. Though there were many acts of valour during this time, one of the Bahá'í defenders in particular became known to friend and foe alike. This brave fighter was a young woman named Zainab. One day, unable to passively watch the attacks on her companions any longer, this young peasant girl cut off her hair and dressed herself in a man's tunic and headdress. Then, grabbing a sword and shield, she took a place at the barricade. Fighting shoulder to shoulder with her fellow Bahá'ís, she showed such courage that the enemy troops soon fled. Hujat was watching from a turret that day. He saw Zainab set out in pursuit of her attackers and recognized her. He sent her a message asking her to return to the fort. Zainab came to speak with him and begged him to allow her to continue fighting. Hujat granted her request, commending her courage, saying, "Not by their outward appearance, but by the character of their beliefs and the manner of their lives does God judge his creatures, be they men or women." Hujat gave her the name Rustam Ali as a mark of her courage and warned her, as he did with all of his soldiers, against any excessive use of force. "We are called upon to defend our lives against a treacherous assailant," he said, "and not to wage holy war against him." For 5 months, Zainab fought valiantly. Those who fought with her were inspired by her courage. Accounts of the siege describe how she was always in the forefront of the turmoil and how her sword was always at her side, even while she slept. A few months into the fighting, Zainab's enemies discovered her secret, but they were still just as frightened of her. It was said that even the sound of her voice terrified her opponents. One day, seeing that her companions were suddenly enveloped by the enemy, she went to Hujat and begged him to allow her to help. Hujat was heartbroken as he knew the danger, but he agreed. Zainab ran out of the fort to the enemy barricades and routed the soldiers from the first 3 of the defences. She was engaging in overcoming the 4th when, beneath a shower of bullets, she dropped dead. After Zainab's death, even her enemies praised her courage and faith, and 20 women of her acquaintance embraced the cause of the Bab. To them, she was no longer just a peasant girl. She was the very incarnation of the noblest principles of human conduct, a living embodiment of the spirit which only a faith such as hers could manifest.
Though separated from our own time by 2 centuries, the society in which the Bab appeared resembles the present-day world for the sense of oppression and for the longing of so many to find answers to slake the soul's thirst to know. 1848 is known as the Year of Revolutions. During that year, popular uprisings broke out all over the world. Ireland was no exception, with the Young Islanders' Rebellion of July 1848. The remarkable thing about these uprisings was that most were not about regime change, but instead were calling for justice, equality, and human rights. Of all the revolutions of 1848, there are two that are often overlooked, though in fact they were among the most ambitious and far-reaching, because they called for justice for the largest oppressed group of all, women. In July 1848, as the Bab, a well-known champion of the rights of women, was being tortured in Iran, in Seneca Falls in New York State, a couple of hundred women and a smaller number of men met to discuss women's rights. 68 women and 32 men voted on what they called the Declaration of Sentiments, advocating equal treatment of women. There was nervousness at the convention about the idea that women should be allowed to vote, but the words of freed slave and abolitionist Frederick Douglass won the day. In this denial of the right to participate in government, not merely the degradation of women and the perpetuation of a great injustice happens, but the maiming and repudiation of one half of the moral and intellectual power of the government of the world. Meanwhile, during the same month as this small group of courageous people in America were calling for the recognition of the equality of women and men, this was also happening at a Babi gathering in Persia, the Conference of Badasht. Here, one lone woman named Tahira entered a group of 80 men and swept away the conventions of the past by calmly speaking in public without wearing her veil. This simple act caused consternation even amongst the group of Babis in attendance, but she was supported by both the Bab and Baha'u'llah. Tahira's courageous actions left no doubt that this new revelation, which was fundamentally about the oneness of humanity, necessarily included the hitherto excluded half of the human race, women. The Seneca Falls women were reviled for their actions, and Tahira was later executed for her beliefs. And unfortunately, in some parts of the world, it still takes great courage to stand up for the rights of women. But those brave souls in 1848 planted a seed that has gradually taken root all over the world. Though it has yet to come to complete fruition, the idea that the equality of women and men has proven to be one of the most revolutionary of all the ideas of 1848. As Tahira is reputed to have said before she was strangled, "You can kill me as soon as you like, but you will not stop the emancipation of women."
By 1850, thousands of people from every walk of life across Persia had become Babis, and the authorities decided that the only way to stop this new religion was to execute the Bab. And so it was decreed that on July the 9th, 1850, the Bab was to be executed by firing squad. The Bab was imprisoned in Tabriz with some of his followers. Among them was a young man named Anis, who begged to be allowed to die with his beloved. On the morning of the 9th of July, the Bab was calmly dictating to his secretary when the head attendant of the prison announced that it was time for the execution. Though he wasn't finished, he agreed to go, saying to the attendant, "Not until I have said to him all those things that I wish to say, can any earthly power silence me. Though all the world be armed against me, yet shall it be powerless to deter me from fulfilling to the last word my intention." The Bab and Anis were led in chains to the barrack square, with thousands of spectators crowding the rooftops all around. Sam Khan, the colonel of the regiment, who had been ordered to carry out the execution, explained to the Bab that he was a Christian and had no desire to execute an innocent man. The Bab told him not to worry. Follow your instructions, and if your intention be sincere, the Almighty is surely able to relieve you of your perplexity. A spike was driven into a pillar, and 2 ropes were fastened to it from which the Bab and Anis were suspended. Sam Khan gave the order, and his regiment opened fire. As the dense smoke from the rifles cleared, the bewildered spectators could see that Anise stood there, unhurt, and that the Bab had vanished. This remarkable occurrence was reported on by a number of foreign journalists and diplomats. On July 22, 1850, the British minister in Persia, Lieutenant Colonel Shield, described the scene in his report to Lord Palmerston, the British Foreign Secretary. When the smoke and dust cleared away after the volley, Bab was not to be seen, and the populace proclaimed that he had ascended to the skies. A frenzied search soon found the Bab in his cell, calmly completing his business with his secretary. I have finished my conversation with Syed Hussein. Now you may proceed to fulfill your intention. The chief attendant remembered their earlier conversation and immediately resigned his post. Sam Khan also remembered the words of the Bab and ordered his men to leave the barracks immediately. Another group of soldiers arrived and the Bab and Anise were once again suspended together on the wall. The new regiment opened fire, and this time they were killed. Their bodies were torn apart by bullets, but their faces were largely unmarked. The authorities threw their mangled bodies outside the gates of the city in the hope that they would be devoured by wild animals. But that night the bodies of the Bab and Anise were secretly rescued by the Baha'is. Their bodies were lovingly preserved and hidden. In 1909, they were finally interred at what is now known as the Shrine of the Bab on Mount Carmel in Israel. The execution of the Bab on July 9, 1850, wasn't the ending envisaged by his persecutors, because, as the first of the twin manifestations of God, the Bab had opened the way for him whom God shall make manifest, and so the execution of the Bab was simply the end of the beginning.
Many religious scriptures contain prophecy about the advent of two messengers of God, one following closely on the other. Baha'is believe that the Bab and Baha'u'llah are the expected twin manifestations, and that their missions are inextricably linked. It has been prophesied that in the time of these two manifestations, the earth will be transformed, the world of existence will be renewed. Justice and truth will encompass the world. Enmity and hatred will disappear. All causes of division among peoples, races and nations will vanish, and the cause of union, harmony and concord will appear. Each manifestation of God has a mission to accomplish. The Bab's mission was to prepare the way for the coming of Baha'u'llah. In his writings, he unequivocally states, "We have planted the garden of the Bayan in the name of him whom God will make manifest, and have granted you permission to live therein until the time of his manifestation." Both the Bab and Baha'u'llah are revered as central figures. Their collected writings are considered by Baha'is to be revelation from God and form the foundation of the Baha'i faith. Throughout the ages, humanity's spiritual, intellectual and moral capacities have been cultivated by the founders of the great religions. Among them, Abraham, Krishna, Zoroaster, Moses, Buddha, Jesus Christ, Muhammad, and in more recent times, the Bab and Baha'u'llah. These figures are not ordinary people. They are manifestations of God, who manifest his attributes and guidance, and have exerted an incomparable influence on the evolution of human society. This piece of calligraphy describes the relationship between God, his messengers and humanity, and the place of the Bab and Baha'u'llah in this relationship. The top line represents the world of God. The middle line represents the world of the revelation of God brought to humanity by his messengers. The bottom line represents the world of humanity. The vertical line joins all of these worlds together. And the stars on each side represent the Bab and Baha'u'llah. Each messenger of God has a distinct individuality and a definite mission, but they all share in a single, divinely ordained purpose: to educate the souls of men and refine the character of every living man. The coming of each manifestation of God releases a fresh outpouring of spirit into creation, and over time, the message they bring provides the main impulse for the development of society. And now concerning thy question regarding the nature of religion, know thou that they who are truly wise have likened the world unto the human temple. As the body of man needeth a garment to clothe it, so the body of mankind must needs be adorned with the mantle of justice and wisdom. Its robe is the revelation vouchsafed unto it by God. Whenever this robe hath fulfilled its purpose, the Almighty will assuredly renew it. For every age requireth a fresh measure of the light of God. Every divine revelation hath been sent down in a manner that befitted the circumstances of the age in which it hath appeared.
The tragedy of religious intolerance had burnt deeply into her soul and had inspired her quest for the path of truth, which she found at last when she came into touch with the Bahá'í revelation. Sarah Louisa Ryan, Lady Blomfield, born in County Tipperary in 1859, was one of the earliest Irish Bahá'ís. Daughter to a Catholic father and Protestant mother, she grew up under the shadow of religious intolerance. This experience set her on a path in search of truth, which she believed she had found in the Bahá'í revelation. Unlike most who occupied a similar position in British society, all of her life, Lady Blomfield was deeply committed to humanitarian work and alleviating the suffering of others. A supporter of the suffragettes and Home Rule for Ireland, she was a fearless protector of the rights of women, children, prisoners, and animals. She found in the teachings of Baha'u'llah the fullest expression and framework for bringing these ideals into reality. Of her belief, she wrote, "Nothing less than the happiness of every human being is the ideal for the Baha'i. He must not loiter by the way on the road to this ideal. He must strive and work and strive until all the regions of the earth shall become resplendent." The Bab's mission began on the 23rd of May, 1844. That same day, Abdul Baha, who was to become a close friend and mentor of Lady Blomfield, was born. Abdul Baha was the eldest son of Baha'u'llah, the one whose cause had been heralded and promised by the Bab. He had been appointed to lead the community after Baha'u'llah's passing and spent most of his life in exile and imprisonment. When finally freed from his imprisonment under the Ottoman Empire in 1908, Abdul Baha set out on extensive journeys to Europe and North America with the aim of spreading the message of the new faith, calling the people of the world to unite with the recognition of their inherent oneness. A decade before Abdul Baha's release, the new faith had already begun to spread throughout the West. Galvanized by the vision of the Christ-promised kingdom of God on earth, these early Western believers longed above all else for an opportunity to meet Abdul Baha. In 1911, Lady Blomfield met Abdul Baha in London, where he began the first of his historic visits to the West. He arrived, and who shall picture him, she wrote. A silence as of love and awe overcame us as we looked at him. Lady Blomfield played a unique role as host to Abdul Baha during his visits to Britain between 1911
and 1913, offering her London home for his use. Her daughter Mary, later recalling her mother during those days, wrote, "I can see my beloved mother, eager, vital, full of sublime enthusiasm, never losing a word or a movement of the Master's, fully realizing that this visit was an event which belonged to the world." She was also a close companion to Abdu'l-Bahá during his visits to Paris, where she took copious notes of his public talks and conversations, which formed the substance of the book Paris Talks. Lady Blomfield became very close to Abdu'l-Bahá and his family. He recognized in her a great capacity for serving others and encouraged her in her humanitarian endeavors. He described her as dearer to me than all the queens of the world, and bestowed on her the name Sitare, meaning star. Having served the Red Cross in France during World War I, Lady Blomfield was horrified at the suffering which had engulfed Europe, and at the end of the war, inspired by the Bahá'í teachings, she turned her attention particularly to the plight of children so grievously impacted by the conflict. In 1919, she assisted in the founding of the Save the Children Fund, fully supported and encouraged by Abdu'l-Bahá, who wrote to her saying, "Contribution, protection, and care of these children are the greatest altruism and worship, and the cause of satisfaction to the Most High, the Almighty." Upon the passing of Abdu'l-Bahá in 1921, Lady Blomfield accompanied his grief-stricken grandson, Shoghi Effendi, back to Haifa from London. Only after his return to the Holy Land did Shoghi Effendi learn that he had been appointed in Abdu'l-Bahā's will and testament as the guardian of the faith, a station which entailed leadership of the worldwide Bahá'í community. Such a monumental responsibility, thrust unexpectedly upon the 24-year-old, came as a great shock. In these days of grief, Lady Blomfield served the young guardian and the family of Abdu'l-Bahá with humility and radiance, developing in particular an intimate friendship with the sister of Abdu'l-Bahá, as well as his widow and daughters. She began to take notes of her conversations with them, realizing the precious opportunity to capture for posterity the memories of these heroic women who had lived through the earliest days of the new faith. She wrote, "Only they can tell certain things, and if not collected now, it would be lost to the world of the future." These spoken chronicles were later published as The Chosen Highway, one of the earliest and most illuminating histories of the Bahá'í faith in English. The stories of the Bab and Baha'u'llah, vividly recounted by members of the family of Abdu'l-Bahá, have proven to be an immortal gift to posterity. Referring in that book to the day the Bab's mission began, she wrote, "What a day in the history of the world. The Bab, the herald of Baha'u'llah, the promised one, opened the new age of mankind." Lady Blomfield's life of service, not only to her faith, but to the welfare of the world at large, through her many humanitarian pursuits, shines out like a star. No wonder that Abdu'l-Bahá gave her that precious name, Sitare, star.
Lead me forth, Lord, amid the wide world's ways, to bear to Thee my witness and to raise the dawn song of the breaking day of days. Make my whole life one flame of sacrificial deeds that shall proclaim the newborn glory of thy ancient name. This was the prayer of George Townsend, the most important figure in the foundation of the Bahá'í faith in Ireland. An ordained priest of the Church of Ireland, he came to see in the Bahá'í cause the fulfillment of the millennia-old Christian hope and devoted his great literary skill to spreading the message of Baha'u'llah. After some decades of service, he formally renounced his clerical position, writing to one bishop in America. My motive is to be loyal to Christ as I know him. I feel I must make any sacrifice in order to be free to help in transmitting to my fellow Christians a message which presents the one and only hope of re-spiritualizing mankind and rebuilding the social order. The answer to his prayer, his longing to raise the dawn song of the breaking day of days, would be his lasting legacy to the world. Born in 1876 to a large and prominent Dublin family, George Townsend initially followed a path that many would have expected of him. He graduated in classics from Oxford in 1899 and became a leader writer for the Irish Times. After further studies, he was called to the Irish bar in 1903. He was troubled, however, his son would later write, by a feeling of restlessness and dissatisfaction. Something imperceptible called him away from Ireland, and he emigrated to the United States in 1904. It was here that he was ordained a priest in 1906. After 12 years in America, he returned to Ireland in 1916. Shortly after his return, he learned of the Bahá'í faith from some pamphlets sent to him by an American friend, which contained some words of Abdu'l-Bahá. He later reflected, "When I looked at those, that was the beginning and the end with me." Soon thereafter, he began a correspondence with Abdu'l-Bahá, expressing his attraction to the teachings and later declaring his belief in Baha'u'llah. In his letters to George, Abdu'l-Bahá addressed him, "O thou who art thirsty for the fountain of truth, O thou illumined soul and revered personage in the kingdom, it is my hope that your church will come under the heavenly Jerusalem." George took this as his mandate. In 1919, he moved to Haskra in County Galway as rector of the small parish. It was here he would work for many years, endeavouring to awaken his fellow clergymen and church community to what he believed to be the fulfilment of their most cherished hopes. He was later elected a canon of St. Patrick's Cathedral in Dublin and became Archdeacon of Clonferth. Abdu'l-Bahá passed away in 1921 and appointed his grandson Shoghi Effendi as guardian of the Bahá'í faith to carry on the work of building and guiding the Bahá'í community. This was no simple task. Beyond the administration and leadership of a growing worldwide community, the Guardian also took on the task of translating the great body of writings of the Bab, Baha'u'llah and Abdu'l-Bahá from the original Persian and Arabic into English, so that they could be widely disseminated to a growing community of Western believers. George was one of a trusted few in Europe, along with Lady Blomfield in London, who would receive manuscripts of English translations from Shoghi Effendi to be reviewed and to offer suggestions. Though committed to his duties in the church, George devoted much of his time and energy to assisting the Guardian in this work from a distance. And so, throughout the years, long before the internet and long before the postal system was very efficient, Shoghi Effendi would send those manuscripts of the first renderings of gleanings from the writings of Baha'u'llah, of the Epistle to the Son of the Wolf, and others to George Townsend, to the rectory down the road, and George would work on them and send them back. The Guardian, having thus made a larger body of scripture accessible to an increasingly global Bahá'í community, began to see the need of expanding their understanding of their shared heritage with believers in the East. The story of the Bab and the heroic souls who embraced and gave their all for his cause in its earliest days was somewhat shrouded in mystery to the early believers of the West. Having for the most part come to their faith through contact with the magnetic personality of Abdul Baha, the lives of the Bab and Baha'u'llah stood at some distance, both historically and culturally. Accounts of the early days of the faith in English were scant and varied, and so the Guardian embarked on the ambitious project of translating one of the most complete and comprehensive histories of the faith written in Persian, known as Nabil's narrative. Nabil-i-Azam became a believer in the time of the Bab and was a close companion of Baha'u'llah throughout his exiles. A talented poet and historian, Nabil compiled his narrative from a vast array of first-hand accounts, many from the Letters of the Living and other contemporaries of the Bab and Baha'u'llah. Shoghi Effendi's translation of the first part of Nabil's narrative, covering the life and martyrdom of the Bab and the years immediately thereafter, was published in 1932 and gave the Bahá'ís of the West a new foundation upon which to build their identity as believers. To George Townsend, as before, he turned for suggestions and also to prepare the introduction, an indispensable bridge from 19th century Persia to those reading in English nearly a century later. George writes in the introduction, "The main features of the narrative speak a language which all may understand, but it is not easy to appreciate how stupendous was the task undertaken by Baha'u'llah and his forerunner without some knowledge of the condition of church and state in Persia and of the customs and mental outlook of the people and their masters." To help bridge that gap, in the introduction, George seized upon the episode of Dr. Cormac, the young doctor of Irish descent who met and treated the Bab in Tabriz. This unique meeting between the Bab and a European contemporary seemed to George to be of great significance and potentially of much interest to people in the West. Citing Cormac's favourable impressions of the Bab, George writes of that episode in his introduction. Such was the impression made by the Bab, and as far as the influence of his character and teaching have since spread through the West, no other record is extant of his having been observed or seen by European eyes. His qualities were so rare in their nobility and beauty, his personality so gentle and so forceful, and his natural charm was combined with so much tact and judgment that after his declaration, he quickly became in Persia a widely popular figure. He would win over almost all with whom he was brought into personal contact, often converting his jailers to his faith and turning the ill-disposed into admiring friends. George Townsend was the most notable figure in Irish Bahá'í history. After formally stepping down from his duties in the church, he became a founding member of the First Spiritual Assembly of Dublin and has remained a guiding light to the community that has grown since then. It was in his writing that he traced his most meaningful path of service to the faith. Shoghi Effendi referred to him as the best writer we have, the preeminent Bahá'í writer. In 1951, he was appointed by the Guardian a Hand of the Cause, one of a select few Bahá'ís whose services had highly distinguished them, the first of whom had lived in the time of the Bab. On his passing in 1957, referring to his sterling qualities, his scholarship, his challenging writings, his high ecclesiastical position, unrivaled by any Bahá'í in the Western world, the Guardian deeply mourned the dearly loved, much admired, greatly gifted, outstanding, hand of the cause. Though remembered for such outstanding achievements, perhaps the greatest legacy of George Townsend, felt in the life of every Baha'i, was the composition of just 2 words. The Guardian had asked him to suggest a title for the translation of Nabil's narrative.
George would get numerous cables from Shoghi Effendi, telegrams that would come to the little post office in Ahaskra, waiting for him to send his suggestion for the title, and George eventually coming up with something and racing down to the post office on his bicycle to cable off his suggestion.
Echoing his prayer of earlier days, he was inspired to suggest that it be called The Dawnbreakers. This title lives ever present in the minds of all Baha'is who strive to live up to the deeds of those dawnbreakers of an heroic age immortalized in that book. Could a clearer answer have been given to George's prayer? Lead me forth, Lord, amid the wide world's ways, to bear to Thee my witness and to raise the dawn song of the breaking day of days.